Hello and welcome to China Tonight. I'm Stan Grant. On the program, Xi Jinping on track to secure a record third term at the National Congress in October. And what is China doing in Antarctica?
It's a bit like bragging rights. Everyone loves penguins. Penguins and seals.
But first tonight, what's making news? And joining me is Yvonne Yong. Yvonne, the United Nations last week released a long-awaited report into human rights abuses in Xinjiang.
Hi Stan. It has been a long time coming. UN Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet had said the report into alleged abuse in the region was being finalised late last year. Calls for it to be released intensified after she visited Xinjiang in May, a move Chinese officials said had given her an opportunity to observe and experience the real Xinjiang. But activists called the visit a betrayal, saying it damaged her credibility and gave the Chinese government cover to deny the alleged abuses. Well, China has been pressuring the UN not to release the report, but in the end, it was finally made public just 11 minutes before the end of Ms. Bachelet's 4-year tenure. In the report, investigators found credible evidence of torture of Uyghur Muslims and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. It said these could amount to crimes against humanity, but it stopped short of calling it genocide. Well, China has dismissed the report, labelling it a Western-led conspiracy.
提到的这份所谓的评估报告，是美国及一些西方势力一手策划制造的，完全非法无效。报告是虚假信息的大杂烩，是服务美西方以疆制华战略的政治工具。
China's permanent mission to the UN replied with a 131-page document. It said mass detentions of minorities in Xinjiang were in strict compliance with the law and with rigorous legal oversight. The statement claimed that fundamentally the education and training centres are schools in nature rather than prisons.
But Uyghur activists and human rights groups say the report demands a swift international response. China Tonight reporter Yehan, a Uyghur who uses a pseudonym for the safety of his family back in China, spoke with community leader Ramila Chanishaff and Yusuf Hussein, an Adelaide-based teacher who hasn't spoken to his family in 5 years.
We've been asking for this report to be released, months, if not a year ago. It's late, but it's welcomed. We just hope the UN will still, and the next High Commissioner will take action with the findings and the recommendations. But now it's up to nation states to take the next steps.
I'm hoping that the world can take a step and they will be with us. I have lost contact with my father, my elder brother, and my younger brother, and my sister's son, Abdurrahman, and another sister's son, Muhammad Amin. These 5 numbers I usually used to contact with them. I lost all of them. I used to call at least once a week. And since 2017, none of them pick up the phone, and some numbers say it's not in service, and some still not answering.
Every Uyghur in Australia and in the diaspora is affected. I have cousins who have been unaccounted for. I don't know whether they're alive, dead, or in prison or in forced labour.
So I try to avoid myself from thinking about them too much, because I have 5 little kids here. I have to look after them. But still, it's affect my daily life and my work.
The survivor's guilt that every Uyghur feels living in Australia while their family members are languishing in camps and forced labour is very difficult to bear. We will always have hope, because without hope, we won't be able to survive.
I keep ringing, but none of them answer. But I still have a hope. I hope that sometime I call midnight, sometime in the middle of the day, sometime in the morning. I thought maybe one day they pick up suddenly.
Wang is a senior researcher on China at Human Rights Watch, working on issues including freedom of expression, women's rights and protection of civil society. She joins me now from New York. Wang, thank you for giving us your time.
Thank you for having me.
I want to get Human Rights Watch response to the UN report. It has cited crimes against humanity. Does that go far enough?
Well, I think I would say it's a huge relief first of all, that the report eventually got published, because it was after such a delay, because the Chinese government has exerted such pressure on the UN not to publish the report. So I'm relieved and I'm glad to see it got published. And also, I think it's a validation to the countless victims who told their stories. You know, they felt their sufferings, their tragedies have been recognized by the UN. And also, it's a validation to us who do research on this issue.
Of course, there are steps to go to from here. It has to go to the UN Human Rights Council. Is China able to apply more pressure at that level?
Well, what we wanted to see is that the report gets presented to the Human Rights Council, then states will take actions together, collectively, at least to launch a full investigation into the crimes in Xinjiang. The High Commissioner's report is just a preliminary study, so we want to see a full study. This is the first step. This is what we want to see, and I'm sure the Chinese government is going to do all kinds of lobbying and advocacy and bullying within the UN, try to stop this from happening. But I feel this report is going to create momentum because the UN has resisted China's pressure, and it should continue to resist the pressure.
What can be done here? Now, there are trade bans and bans on products that are made with forced labour. Do you want to see an increase on that sort of economic pressure?
Absolutely. I want to see increase and more forceful actions. Give you an example, the US government has in June enacted a law called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which bans imports that come from Xinjiang or go through Xinjiang. And I want to see more governments around the world do that, because sanctions, imports bans can only be effective when governments do it together. I don't want to see a situation, the Chinese going to feel, okay, now we cannot export to the US, let's export to Australia.
You specifically want to see Australia take a stronger stance?
Yes. I wanted the Australian government, the parliament, to enact a similar law as the law that has been enacted in the US. I wanted the Australian government to ban, to sanction Chinese government officials who are implicated in the Xinjiang abuses. I wanted the Australian government to sanction Chinese surveillance companies that are selling surveillance equipment in Xinjiang.
Now, the Chinese government has put out its own response to this report. It continues to allege terrorism by Uyghur groups. It defends its position. It talks about bringing harmony and stability to China, about economic opportunity for the Uyghur population. As someone who has looked at this from the inside, can you explain how China sees the Uyghur population and defends its actions?
So there are abundant evidence showing that the persecutions are absolutely real, and for the government to say otherwise is absurd. To the Chinese government, they view, they say Uyghurs engaged in terrorist acts, things like that. There's no real evidence. There were sporadic, violent attacks against Han Chinese people by, Uyghurs in the past, but those incidents never amounted systematic terrorist acts. So I would say, the government's allegations are baseless.
Just finally, Yaqiu, what about your own concerns here? You're a Chinese person working in this area, albeit you're outside of the country. But what sort of pressure is applied to you or your family?
I am concerned, and honestly speaking, there have always been pressure on me and my family, and I don't want to get into the details because that may even incur more pressure. But I would say, yes, it happens to me, and it happens to many people working in this field. It's just something that you have to deal with for anybody who work in this field, for anybody who criticizes the Chinese government, even when you're based abroad.
You don't want to go into details, but is it enough to make you feel afraid?
Well, I think I manage the pressure. I manage the risks. Of course, I'm afraid. Of course, there's fear and there's concern. There's worry at the back of my head every day. But, as I said, for anybody who work in this field, this is something that you have to face. It's not about me. It's about anyone who criticize the government.
Yaqiu, Wang, thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having me.
While the UN report has put China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims in the spotlight, it also raises questions about China's relationship with religious freedom at large. Karen Tong examines how faith fits in China's modern socialist society.
A long time ago, a severe drought was ravaging a small village in China. In desperation, a great woman left her child at home to perform a rain dance. And it worked. The rain came. But then, a white snake demon entered her home and devoured her baby. With her last ounce of energy, she killed the snake.
So that is the story of Mother Chen.
In the city of Wenzhou, many people worship Mother Chen. There's even a temple dedicated to her accomplishments and various festivals giving thanks to her sacrifice.
在我以往，我觉得只是跟随母亲去做这件事情。现在的话，我们可能更多的是崇拜她的这份精神吧。我们每年的正月，我们会去参加那个祈福，从内心里面去恭敬她。
Mother Chen is an example of what's known as a folk religion or popular religion in China, of which there are thousands.
Part of the definition of popular religion is that it's very localized. So popular religion in one place may differ quite a lot from a neighboring county. So different kinds of gods and different customs and practices.
Folk religions typically have strong links to Taoism. It's an ancient religion of China, and one of the 5 religions officially recognized by the Chinese government, alongside Buddhism, Catholicism, Protestantism, and Islam. Allahu Akbar, Allah. The Chinese Communist Party is officially atheist.
If you want to join the Communist Party or the Communist Youth League, you have to declare that you are an atheist.
While religious freedom is in the Constitution and the party acknowledges that there are millions of believers, it's the official party line that all religions must have Chinese characteristics and adapt to the modern socialist country.
The socialist society does not require religious believers to give up theistic thoughts, but requires them to politically love the motherland, support the socialist system, and support the party's leadership.
In this vein, China has tightened its control of religion.
2 uniformed officers arrived to check on the congregation.
Tibetan Buddhists have been arrested for displaying pictures of the Dalai Lama. The Vatican has agreed to only appoint bishops who support the party. In Xinjiang, thousands of mosques have reportedly been demolished, with documented crackdowns on the region's Muslim Uyghur minority.
It's the largest mass detention of an ethnic or religious group since the Second World War.
There's mounting evidence China is committing genocide in Xinjiang.
In recent years, both the religious affairs and ethnic minority affairs have become under tight control. In Xinjiang, before Xi Jinping, ethnic minorities have more leverage to argue for having more mosques. The cracking down on them also harsher than some of the other religions.
In a visit to the region in July, President Xi Jinping emphasised that people are free to practice religion, as long as it doesn't conflict with CCP values. He outlined that the party should educate and guide people on this correct view of religion.
We must better uphold the principle of developing Islam in the Chinese context and provide active guidance for the adaptation of religions to the socialist society.
Yet, even with the Chinese government regulating religion, people continue to practice their faith.
Many people still can have religious activities both inside the officially approved venues and also unofficial venues. They can still manage to do it.
So long as it conforms to the status quo, and that includes folk religions like Mother Chen.
它会给到我们一份安慰，心灵的安慰，它能让人升起一个叫无所恐惧的这种不害怕的心啊，它会让人很多的勇气，跟我们一些百姓的精神，它是对他来是有一种叫护佑啊，有一种依靠，对他的这份精神非常的敬佩。
And now for what's making news on the platforms the people themselves use, Weibo and WeChat. Yvonne, one of China's biggest cities has gone into lockdown as COVID cases spike.
That's right, 21 million people in Chengdu have been ordered to stay home, Stan, after just 157 new cases were identified there on Thursday. Now, this means there are now more than 30 cities across China in full or partial lockdown, affecting around 65 million people. It's more evidence the Chinese government isn't planning to shift from its COVID-0 policy anytime soon.
Essential services like supermarkets, pharmacies, and hospitals will remain open. Restaurants are only allowed to offer takeaway, and employees of those places should get tested every day. Every household can send one person with a negative test result to do their shopping once a day.
Now check out these images which went viral online. They show people panic buying and stocking up on essentials before the lockdown in Chengdu began. Now this woman reportedly didn't even want to finish her hairdressing appointment. Well, students were supposed to return to the classroom for the new school year this week too. Now they'll be learning from home. People have taken to Weibo to vent their frustrations.
It's been 3 years. Why are we still talking about lockdown?
Can I go home for the Mid-Autumn Festival?
This is never ending.
I just want to know if I have to work tomorrow.
And we knew the National Congress was coming, and now we know when.
Yes, China has set a date for the twice-a-decade event where President Xi Jinping is expected to be anointed for an historic third term. State media last week announced the meeting of party leaders will start on October the 16th and is expected to last about a week.
中国共产党第20次全国代表大会是在全党全国各族人民迈上全面建设社会主义现代化国家新征程、向第2个100年奋斗目标进军的关键时刻召开的一次十分重要的大会。
On social media, users expressed their support for the meeting. One commented that it will be a moment in history, while another said it would bring a new era of a beautiful China. Well, those hoping for a new era are instead very likely to be getting more of the old, with the meeting almost certain to reappoint Xi Jinping as General Secretary of the Communist Party, all but assuring his leadership of China for another 5 years and possibly more.
Yvonne, thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Professor Steve Chang is the director of the China Institute at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. He's leading a research project examining the political thought of Xi Jinping and how the ideology is shaping China. He joins me now from London. Steve Chang, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
I want to ask you, first of all, what the next 5 years in China look like under Xi Jinping rule.
Well, it does look very likely that Xi Jinping will get his term of office extended as leader of China for at least another 5 years, and possibly rather longer. And he will be looking at redoubling everything that he has been doing. He is a man with a mission, and the mission is to make China great again. In the mythical past of China, when China was the center of the world. And that's basically what he wants to do. He wants to make China rich and powerful, and so rich and so powerful that the rest of the world will simply admire and follow China.
That's what's described as Xi Jinping thought. You've been looking into this, you've been studying this. It's his own ideology. But what is it?
Well, Xi Jinping thought is still a work in progress. It's not yet fully completed, and it will not be fully completed until Xi Jinping dies or loses office. So he will continue to develop that. It is not quite a full ideology yet, but he intends it to become the state ideology of China in place of just old-fashioned socialism with Chinese characteristics. There is some element of socialism in it, but not the classic Marxist socialism. He does not, for example, believe in from home according to his ability and to home according to his needs. But he does want to reduce the scale of inequality in society. But above all, it is the Leninist part of the Marxist-Leninism that Xi Jinping focused on. It's about control.
And that's the critical part, isn't it? In a word, is this about power?
It is about power and about control. And therefore, it means that the party leads everything in every sphere of work in the whole country. And when China becomes the dominant power in the world, then that will extend from China to beyond the borders of China. Right at the center of that is Xi Jinping himself. He sees his system as clearly superior to that of the West. And that's why he wants to share it with the rest of the world.
Is Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party in position to deal with the challenges that China is facing? COVID, of course, we've seen the impact of that. There is a rapidly aging population, a slowing economy, and potentially more international isolation.
Well, the Communist Party before Xi Jinping was in a sense, in a better position to deal with that kind of challenges than the Communist Party under Xi Jinping. Now, that is exactly the opposite of the narrative prevailing in China at the moment. Now, why do I say what I said? It's because before Xi Jinping, the Communist Party operated under collective leadership. Since Xi Jinping consolidated his power in 2017, after 5 years of office, we have seen the end of collective leadership being replaced by strongman rule. And it now all depends on Xi Jinping getting it right. And he is now showing that he is making quite a few very important wrong calls, which are causing the Chinese economy to get into greater difficulties than it otherwise would have been.
Let me ask you a very direct question that is on the minds of a lot of people. Should we be afraid of a future under Xi Jinping?
Well, if Xi Jinping gets his way and stay in power in China for the next 10 to 20 years, I think that is a world that we need to be very uncomfortable with, if not actually being scared with.
Just a final question. How popular does Xi Jinping remain in China? Is there the possibility of an overthrow from within?
Well, the possibility of overthrowing Xi Jinping at the moment is very, very slim. I mean, the prospect of a popular uprising removing Xi Jinping is practically negligible. And the prospect of an internal party efforts to get rid of him, some kind of a coup, is also very, very low because of the kind of mechanism put in place for controlling the top level leadership. As to the popularity of Xi Jinping, allow me to answer it in two parts. Until a year ago, I would say without qualification that Xi Jinping was very, very, very popular in the country as a whole, much more than inside the Communist Party itself. And if he had fair and open elections, he would win with a landslide. Today, with the effect of the zero COVID policy, I think we are seeing much more discontent within the Chinese population who were affected by the zero COVID policy in terms of how they feel about the leadership. But since we are not allowed to actually access public opinion in China in an open and scholarly way, we can't know how much impact it has.
Steve Chang, again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And finally tonight, while China is located more than 13,000 kilometres from the Antarctic region, it's been steadily building its capacity on the icy continent. Like other nations, China is there for science and resource industries like fishing. But some are nervous about their ambitions. Samuel Yang has the story.
The ice continent is calling to the brave, the curious and the tourists from afar. Oh, cute!
I visited Antarctica 5 years ago, and the boat I was on, a third of them were Chinese tourists. And we visited the Great Wall Station, which is the first Antarctic research station of China.
Thousands of Chinese tourists visited Antarctica each year pre-pandemic for the ice, wedding photos, or simply novelty. Unfortunately, the ABC won't send me. Something about wasting taxpayers' money? I don't know. So apparently the next best thing is this green screen and speaking to someone who has been.
It's a bit like bragging rights. Everyone loves penguins. Penguins and seals.
Yunjiang has not only been to Antarctica, she's an expert on China and has written about the ambitions in the region, which are growing.
China only went to Antarctica in the 80s, and its first trip to Antarctica was actually with an Australian team. After its initial trip, it started building its own research stations and then joined the Antarctic Treaty.
So what is this Antarctic Treaty? Okay, let's put this green screen to good use. The Antarctic Treaty, signed by 12 countries in 1959, establishes that no single country owns Antarctica. The deal struck allows countries to conduct scientific research, but not military activities. China joined in the 1980s under the same terms. The Antarctic Treaty helps keep the status quo and now has 54 members.
China, I think it also needs to be acknowledged as being fairly significantly engaged in the Antarctic Treaty system.
This is Professor Donald Rothwell, who has dedicated his life to international law of the sea and polar regions. He has sadly never been to Antarctica.
So China actually has got quite a bit of credibility in terms of its Antarctic scientific research program, its Antarctic diplomatic program, and it's certainly a fully engaged player in the Antarctic Treaty system.
China is now building its fifth base, a third icebreaker, and reportedly the world's largest crew fishing vessel.
For China, one of its biggest priorities when it comes to Antarctica is access to potential resources. We're talking about things like fisheries. And another really increasingly important issue is climate change.
The Antarctic is meant to be neutral territory, but that hasn't prevented geopolitical tensions impacting the atmosphere.
China's increasing power has caused some friction with the existing established powers, that is true, including with Australia. It wants to have more of a say in a lot of international negotiations in Antarctic governance.
I think there's a bit of unease as to why China, who is not a traditional Antarctic or even a polar state, is investing so much into its Antarctic diplomacy, in terms of its Antarctic scientific program, partly because of this uncertainty and ambiguity in terms of what exactly are China's goals and strategies.
They don't share the same objectives as Australia as a treaty nation when it comes to protecting Antarctica.
The previous Morrison government pledged $800 million right before the recent election to invest in surveillance drones, helicopters and other vehicles to shore up Australia's presence in Antarctica. This put China on the offence, who say they are abiding by the treaty.
As Morrison continues to whine about the threat of China ahead of a looming federal election in the country, he seems to have directly tied the Antarctic plan to Australia's national security.
Under the treaty, military personnel and equipment are allowed, but this must be declared. There are allegations of some level of undeclared military activity by China, but other experts say it's difficult to verify. But again, China's transparency is the issue.
A spotlight has been shone on some of China's activities by a number of researchers and scholars, but there's not necessarily a great deal of clarity about that, partly because some of those activities may well be entirely legitimate, but also because there's not a lot of transparency about what some of China's activities are.
So, what's the new government's take? The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade says,
"We are not aware of any contravention of the treaty's non-militarization provision."
For now, the treaty holds and the status quo remains.
China is not the dominant power, so it is quite restrained in what it can do.
But as geopolitical tensions simmer, scientists and tourists on the continent carry on with their adventures. Right, Penguin?
One more time, and on your left, maybe this time. Other side left.
Yeah, right.
And that's all for this week. Next week on the show, the best way to keep a hungry ghost satisfied. I'm Stan Grant. Have a great night.